drivers who are operating CDLs will run into those, and those violations could be considered serious by the DOT, whereas a driver of a normal vehicle might get a slap on the wrist, if anything.
Well, our topic here is state CDL revocation. You had a situation you ran into recently that made you think of this issue. Tell us what happened.
So we had a driver come to us after the worst had already happened. He had gotten a couple of tickets within a couple of years and thought that they wouldn't affect him because they were so far apart. They were in different states. However, when he just paid those tickets and let them climb onto his driving record, he discovered that the state DOT, who had been monitoring the status of his record, was flagging him for these violations specifically in relationship to his CDL certification. So, although his regular license seemed fine, he hadn't gotten enough points on his license record to warrant any kind of suspension or disciplinary action. His CDL was not. So he discovered, again, in the worst possible way, that he it basically didn't have a CDL for a period of 60 days. He discovered this while on the road, while hauling a load. He pulled into a weigh station for a regular inspection. The DOT officer ran his license as you normally would, and it popped up in the system as a revoked CDL. So he had to hitch a ride back to his home state, go through a bunch of hoops with his DMV, and eventually had to sit for 60 days while that revocation went through. That was the period of time that had been preset. And then after that, he was able to get that back after paying a short fee and get back on the road. So it was a huge ordeal that he went through. And it was all caused by a couple of factors. One was that he hadn't been paying very close attention to how these tickets might affect him over time, which is understandable. They were individual tickets that were gotten years apart. But he was also, this is the other part, was not aware of how those tickets would be affecting his CDL certification, not just his regular license.
Well, you mentioned that he wasn't kind of paying attention to what was happening with this and how these things had built up into a revocation. What are the places you would go on a regular basis to check to see if you are approaching this type of problem?
That's a really good question, and it's not out front of any sort of thing that you would normally see as a driver. So, like I said, I don't blame this guy at all. Totally understandable that he would get blindsided by this. Um, the place that you would go is you'd have to go approach your DMV in your home state where you have your license, and either whether searching online or talking to someone in a DMV office, get their printed list of violations that specifically affect CDL drivers and their policies on how they manage those violations. So, in this instance, with the state of Wisconsin, the driver had two violations that qualified him for, or that were marked by the state of Wisconsin as serious or high profile or something like that DOT violations for a CDL driver. He got those, and then basically their paperwork said that if he got any violations within those categories within any certain period of time, in this case within 2 years, that he would be qualifying for a revocation of his license. So it's a lot of jargon, and there's a lot of, like I said, a lot of things that aren't really obvious about this, but every state has this sort of secondary list that has both violations and consequences on it, applying only to CDL drivers, and that's held by the DMV.
Well, you mentioned this was Wisconsin. I'm curious, with every state having their own list, how much do these vary from state to state, or are they fairly similar throughout the country?
They are pretty similar. At least you'll see things in similar categories. Most states, their bottom line is that they want to stop bad driving and keep drivers with bad behavior off the roads. So you'll see some pretty common violations crop up again and again. Things like high speeding. For a CDL driver, it might be being on your cell phone while you have or while you're operating the truck, even maybe driving a CMV without specific CDL certification. That might crop up as well. They want to enforce safe driving. And for CDL drivers, that means something extra than it does for just normal drivers.
Okay. You had mentioned in an email earlier what you called special violations. Is that kind of what we're talking about here, or does that term refer to something else?
Hmm. So yeah, special violations is not an official term necessarily. It's just a kind of catch-all term for things that might affect a CDL driver, but would not necessarily affect a driver with a regular license driving a non-CMV. So a cell phone ticket is a perfect example. Another one is a lane restriction violation. So drivers are not supposed to have cell phones, using cell phones, holding cell phones, anything like that while in the truck. And also, most states have pretty strict enforcement of use of the left-hand lane, the passing lane. So drivers who are operating CDLs will run into those, and those violations could be considered serious by the DOT, whereas a driver of a normal vehicle might get a slap on the wrist, if anything, for doing similar things.
I know that a lot of people, when they talk about suspension or problems with their CDL, they're looking at the point systems that various states have, where you get points for different offenses. Is that a common way that can lead to suspension of the license?
It is the most common. So everything that we're talking about today is less likely to happen to drivers. And the reason for that is that most drivers who are getting tickets and those violations are hitting their record, they're coming in such quantity that they're going to end up with um, basically the regular kinds of penalties uh, before any of this other strange back end stuff comes into play. So basically, if you're driving poorly, the chances are you'll keep driving poorly. And if those consequences are hitting your record, then you're gonna see that as a hey, you're gonna hit a 60-day suspension or a 90-day suspension or something like that. However, there are a lot of drivers out there who are trying to do their best, and that was the case with this guy from Wisconsin, trying to do his best, trying to keep his record clean, made a couple of mistakes very far apart, which were victimless mistakes. He was speeding in one case, and in another case, he had a cell phone in his hand. Generally, a really good driving record. Those were the only things on his record, and they were over a year apart. However, because he had a relatively clean driving record otherwise, these two things were, I guess, that they stood out in such a way that the DOT flagged him, and he got that revocation.
Kind of looking at that point system there again. One of the things that I've heard about over the years is that because different states have different point systems and different points or numbers of points assigned to different offenses, that you may get a something that's a 3-point violation in the state where you received the violation, but that could end up being a completely different number of points. How do you track that kind of thing? I mean, should you only be paying attention to what the point value is and the point system is in your home state?
Absolutely. It can be maddening to try to figure out beforehand, how is this ticket going to affect me? If I get it in another state, if I pay it, will they report it? How will they report it? Really, you should, if at all possible, refer to the experts on that. And by the experts, I mean um, people who work traffic law in both states. So you could ask someone in the state where you got the ticket, hey, you're an attorney here. How do you think this will affect me in this court? And you could ask an attorney in your home state, hey, if this went onto my record, how do you think it would affect me? So you're kind of getting both sets of information in order to make the best decision for what to do with your ticket, because you may find that, for instance, in Georgia, if you were to get a speeding ticket there, but your license is in Florida, well, Florida is going to hit you for several points for a speeding violation, no matter what. If it's reported over to them, you're not going to like it. However, Georgia may not report a speeding violation that's under a certain speed, under 5 or 10 miles an hour. I can't remember exactly what it is right now. So you may have that speeding violation in Georgia, and the attorney there may say, hey, it's not going to report out of state. The attorney in Florida may say, hey, if this reports to your license, you're in trouble. But that Georgia guy's giving you information, letting you know you don't have to worry about it.
I'm curious. You mentioned that kind of case where, like, you get the ticket in Georgia, you're from Florida. Um, I've heard people say, and I don't know if this is correct, and this is why I'm asking, that if you get enough points in a state other than the one where you're based, that other state could potentially suspend your license. Is that a real problem?
Hmm. That's a really good question. I don't believe that's true.
Mm.
The experience that I have had where a request for suspension comes from a different state is almost always tied to something that was left undone in a court, or unfinished in a court, I should say. So if you forget about a ticket, if you leave it unpaid, if you don't fulfill all your requirements to the court, then the court can request a suspension that goes up through their DMV system over to your home state's DMV, and then your home state will let you know, hey, there's something going on in this other state. We will suspend your license if you don't deal with it.
We just got a little bit of time left, but I did want to ask this last question here. Once you have your license suspended, what is your next step? What should you be doing right away to try and get things back on track?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So first, you've got to find the source of the problem. We've already talked about a couple of different things that could happen to you, but reading through any information that you've gotten to let you know that you're suspended, talking with the officer, if the officer was the one who let you know, he might have his database pulled up and can give you some information, or going straight to your DMV. Ultimately, your DMV is the one who puts a suspension in place. And so they have the best information about how to get that cleared away. And then from there, you can go in whatever direction that you need to in order to get that off. But the faster you can act, the faster you might be able to get your license back. Some suspensions are for a set period of time. Some suspensions are indefinite until you fix the problem. So the sooner you can act with good information, the sooner you can get back on the road.
Fantastic. David, thank you very much for the information. Sure appreciate it.
You're welcome.